the whole story is far more complex than just racism. And having grown up in a society which was racist and under apartheid for all these years, I've learned to basically to soften my own criticism of apartheid and the people that were involved.
The struggle against apartheid, I remember it well. I was a student in the 1980s. It was such a noble struggle. The Afrikaners, who were practically Nazis, their language even sounded German, holding down the blacks, like the massacre at Sharpeville. The saint-like Nelson Mandela in jail for African freedom. His party, the ANC, struggling to fight against the white regime, so that a good society for blacks and whites would be formed. It was a simple struggle between good and evil. It had to be so because the pop stars told us. I write books on history and find almost everything I start investigating reveals a truth different from what the average person who reads the mainstream media believes, or who listens to the witterings of pop stars. The Western media got a lot of things wrong lately. WMDs in the Iraq War, Gaddafi massacring his own people, that ivermectin couldn't cure COVID, that lockdowns worked. These falsehoods have had huge consequences and are in part, I believe, the result of the unhealthy relationship between Western media and Western intelligence agencies who brief them. Maybe they got things wrong about earlier events too. Take South Africa and apartheid. Just consider the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, which kicked off the modern anti-apartheid struggle, as reported here by mainstream CBS News.
Every month, Esme Mayseals tends to the grave of the father she never knew, born just 2 months after his death. It's her way to honor him for losing his life at a protest against apartheid. Do you know why he went?
I don't think it would have been noble of him to remain at home.
You're proud of your father?
Very. To this day, to this moment.
On March 21st, 1960, Zacchaeus Mayseals joined 3,000 other black South Africans to protest one of the most hated restrictions against the nation's black majority, passbooks, which controlled their every movement. Lydia Mahubuke remembers. Even if you had a visitor in your house, she said, you'd have to report them to the police station. They would tell you how long your visitor could stay. Sharpeville's residents gathered peacefully in front of the police station without those passbooks. Their objective, to be arrested. But police opened fire, shooting protesters in the back as they ran for their lives. Ibram Mafoking still has a bullet lodged in his spine. What were you thinking?
We were all in fear. There was no time to think. We just trying to escape.
In 2 minutes, police fired more than 1,300 bullets. 69 people lay dead in the streets. Johannes Sefatsa's brother was shot in the back as he ran.
When I looked at his bed, his empty bed, he was not there. So it's then that I started crying.
Police hauled away the bodies, fearing a funeral procession of 69 hearses would spark unrest.
This recent US mainstream television report about the shootings at Sharpeville was a classic in the genre of re-establishing the conventional wisdom originally written back when fighting apartheid was the biggest moral issue in the world. It's a conventional wisdom, a conventional narrative, where the place I'm about to visit fits in smugly. Vlakplaas was the torture centre of the paramilitary squad of the South African police. Today it's a deserted set of buildings just beyond the copse of trees there. It's closed to visitors. It's seen today as the epicentre of apartheid evil, the very heart of darkness. And that's true as far as it goes. The hit squad tortured and killed people at Vlakplaas and murdered many more in raids, frequently to neighbouring countries. Estimates of deaths at Vlakplaas and from Vlakplaas range from the dozens to the many hundreds. But we need to apply some context. Apartheid is still an emotionally hot topic for Westerners over the age of 50. But as it slowly fades into history, perhaps some objectivity is in order. As transitions from one system to another go, the killings by the South African regime remain low. When France decolonised from Algeria, hundreds of thousands of Algerians died. When Britain fought the Mau Mau rebellion in the 50s before leaving Kenya, then a colony with a large white population, thousands were killed. Sharpeville was the event that showed the evil face of the apartheid regime in 1960. In fact, there were extenuating circumstances. South African policemen had been murdered while on liquor patrol at a place called Kato Manor, and the policemen at Sharpeville thought the same would happen to them.
And there was fury among the locals because the shebeen owner, a Zulu lady, claimed that a policeman had stepped on her foot. And so they assaulted this group and they massacred and dismembered them. And there was a little group of about 10 policemen. So at Sharpeville, just a few months later, a group of 20,000 black people mobilized by the Pan-Africanist Congress and armed with sticks and stones and spears and stuff were taunting the police contingent, which was about 150 inside this compound which had a fence around it, and saying to them, we're going to kill you like the policemen killed in Kato Manor. And the shooting started when this crowd had surged forward and flattened this perimeter fence. And of course, when the shooting started, they ran, and this lasted for less than a minute till the officers could regain control and say stop, because the policemen were shooting out of fear for their lives when they saw this surging mass of 20,000 people surging towards them, which is no excuse for that kind of ill discipline. And that fortunately stimulated the police force to adopt proper crowd control techniques and obtain the necessary equipment and prepare themselves so as not to have a repeat of that.
In a standard book for university graduates in the West, apartheid was defeated by Western sanctions and ANC strikes, rent boycotts and stay away. The so-called regime threw in the towel after enormous pressure. In this interpretation, the regime was just reactive and unthinking, thoroughly evil. But when you talk to people from the old regime, they're actually doing some thinking of their own. They were not stick in the muds. They wanted to end apartheid, and they were just waiting for the right moment. They knew Mandela was a man of exceptional political talent, and that he would be present. They were in talks with him in prison and without. Mandela lived quite a comfortable life by the end. And they didn't want their own extremists sabotaging things, nor did they want Mandela to get too influenced by the ANC's extremist wing based in Zambia.
One argument made by apartheid leaders was the more or less true statement that democracy in black Africa had never turned out well before. Liberated states nearly always turn into one-party states, and they're certainly not going to be hurried into reforms by insolent British journalists.
The government must talk to the ANC. But when Foreign Minister Botha was asked by a British reporter would he meet Mandela, he said,
Why is that question important to you? If we are at this present moment, more than any other government before us, continuously talking with black leaders in this country, black leaders who have a right to criticize us, a right which they do not have in the rest of Africa at all, and you know that very well.
Because Nelson Mandela appears to be the black leader whom most black people would support.
It appears to be to you at this present juncture.
It appears to be to black people.
I've given you my answer. If it's not good enough for you, then it's up to you.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 gave the regime its chance to set Mandela free. There was no risk now that the ANC would ever turn South Africa into a Soviet socialist satellite state, now that the Soviet Union was gone. The ANC guerrillas, who'd never really troubled the regime militarily, were allowed to return home. And that, sadly, is when the mayhem started.
There were regular clashes in the townships now between the ANC guerrillas and their black African rivals, with the security forces often in vain trying to keep the peace between them. At the official level, President de Klerk organised the Constitutional Convention that would finally dismantle apartheid and set the stage for a post-apartheid democratic South Africa. At the first conference, CODESA won. Mandela and the ANC won all their political battles. They were on a roll.
The ANC did well at CODESA 1. There were 19 participants. Most of them seemed to back pretty much everything that the ANC said they wanted. But then things went wrong for the ANC at CODESA 2. And by then, de Klerk had come forward with his idea for this election in 1992, later in the year. And not only the IFP, but a whole number of the smaller homeland parties were getting worried about a highly centralized system, which was what the ANC was pushing towards. And most parties backed the National Party. The ANC lost that vote at CODESA 2. So of the 19, there were the ANC and 7 others. All the rest were against the ANC. Now this was a defeat at CODESA 2. And it was important because if they could be defeated once, they could be defeated again. They wanted to change the whole basis of the negotiation.
So now the National Party, the party of the apartheid regime, with President de Klerk at its head, had wind in its sails after CODESA 2. It had lined up most of the black parties against the ANC for early elections and a decentralized system that would protect minorities like the whites or the Bushmen. This was a disaster for the ANC, which still needed to build up its strength and which wanted central rule over the whole of South Africa. Of the black parties siding with the National Party, by far the most important was the Inkatha Party of the Zulus, also known as the IFP.
Inkatha was one of the most credible alternative black parties, with a strong presence among the Zulus, South Africa's largest tribe. They were committed to power sharing with whites, believed in the market economy, and had always denounced violence. Their leader, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, was less charismatic than Mandela and not spent time in jail, but he was just as thoughtful and clever. But in a world and South African opinion, Inkatha became increasingly discredited as a negotiation partner and possible participant in government after a large number of massacres that Inkatha's people carried out against their ANC rivals. What the media omitted to mention was that these large-scale attacks were revenge attacks against a far larger number of pinprick murders and necklacings carried out by the ANC.
ANC activists roamed Boipatong and scared Inkatha supporters into taking refuge in a workers' hostel called KwaMadala. By day 2 of the ANC's patrols in search of enemies, in the words of one observer, the familiar barbecue smell of burning Inkatha sympathizers began to waft through Boipatong. After the deaths of 40 people that day, the barricaded Inkatha activists resolved to hit back. Gathering AKs and panga knives, they broke out, but finding no young ANC warriors, fell upon women and children, brutally massacring 39 of them. And now the world media, led by the BBC, woke up and paid attention.
Massacre of 39 people at the Boipatong squatter camp on Wednesday night. The ANC Secretary-General blamed President de Klerk for the murders and warned that the negotiations on South Africa's future were in serious danger.
Through the morning winter smog, a minority of the people of Boipatong make their way to work. Others stay behind in the township. The strike is a protest against a massacre.
People still angry, huh?
They are still angry. They are still angry.
Equally outraged, Archbishop Tutu, who visited Boipatong this afternoon and offered his verdict.
Absolutely barbaric, yes, and we are just shattered.
On top of all this, the ANC then claimed that Inkatha had not only attacked without provocation, but that they had been supplied and supported by the South African security police, citing witness testimonies of men in camouflage uniforms unloading weapons. They called this the Third Force, and an ANC march went to police headquarters to demand the security police turn themselves in. It made good television and made headlines around the world.
And the government of complicity.
De Klerk must give a full account on why he continues to slaughter our people.
They then demanded the presence of a senior intelligence officer they accused of knowing about the planned massacre.
We are here to ask Colonel House to come out, and to come out now.
At a press conference the same day, Ramaphosa laid the blame for the killings at the door of de Klerk in person, and he also warned that the Boipatong massacre had put entire negotiations into jeopardy. A famous leftist writer called Rian Malan commented by saying that within the space of 48 hours, the theme of government culpability was embellished and hugely amplified by the press, aided by so-called independent violence monitors with unacknowledged links to the ANC. Foreign reporters and diplomats were taken around Boipatong and introduced to eyewitnesses who backed the ANC's claims. Meanwhile, certain journalists were granted special access to hundreds of witness statements said to contain damning evidence of the identity of the attackers. By the end of the week, Boipatong was as famous in its way as Buchenwald or My Lai, and observers had little reasons to doubt that the security forces had been caught red-handed. But all this, says Anthea Jeffrey, is wrong. The ANC were the ones who provoked the attack. The Inkatha had not planned the provocation or the massacre, and the security forces were not involved. Just as at Sharpeville, the world media got completely the wrong end of the stick.
And eventually had a criminal trial in which 17 people from KwaZulu were all convicted of murder. But they were not sentenced to death because the trial judge found that they were all refugees from ANC violence. And he also found that there was absolutely no evidence of police involvement, that something like 120 residents of Boipatong were called to testify. 2 of them gave evidence that they had seen the police helping, but in loco inspections, further cross-examination showed that they were lying, that they couldn't have seen what they claimed to have seen, and it was the testimony of all the others which confirmed that the police had not played a role in the killing.
Another incident, you could say, created by the ANC was the Bisho massacre, when the ANC marched on the independent homeland of Ciskei from which they had been banned. They bypassed the Ciskei riot police, who had non-lethal means of deterring crowds, by taking a side route and confronted the armed Ciskei troops behind, who fired on and killed dozens, creating more martyrs for world opinion.
Automatic weapons.
So was that by accident, or do you think it was planned provocation?
I think it was planned, and that was pretty much even Goldstone, who was wary of upsetting the ANC, thought that there had been an element in which the ANC was careless of the lives of these people. The Ciskei Commission of Inquiry said they led them like lambs to the slaughter. And after that, de Klerk changed his mind, I think, in essence. Didn't want to have another massacre, didn't want to have more lives. And so he agreed to what the ANC had long wanted, that there would be a new process of negotiations. Gedesa was scrapped, it never came back. That in future the ANC and the NP would negotiate, Rolf Meyer and Ramaphosa, and the agreements which they reached would effectively just be rubber stamped by the multi-party negotiating process. Effectively, it sort of put a kind of noose around the negotiations. De Klerk was now taken away from the solidarity that he'd enjoyed in Cadessa too. He was on his own negotiating with the ANC through Wolf Mayer. And the ANC had all the worldwide credibility. De Klerk had none. He needed to reach a deal by 1994, which was when his term of office would expire. So increasingly he started to capitulate. And then the rest of the parties would have no basis except to go along with it, which is why Carter and various others walked out of the negotiations and said they weren't willing to give them credibility because they weren't genuine negotiations anymore. They were just bilateral talks rubber-stamped by everybody else.
Having outmaneuvered their Inkatha rivals and got their way on all points, the ANC handsomely won the 1994 elections and were able to rule South Africa as a centralised state as they'd always wanted. Their majority was guaranteed, as they scooped up nearly all the black vote. As the true story of the ANC's victory has emerged, some former Anglo-liberals and ANC sympathisers have realised that the security forces from Vlakplaas, though they did many bad things, were not the enablers of Inkatha violence. They were not the third force, and indeed that the story of apartheid was more complicated than they once thought.
Take overseas visitors there. Most of my guests are American. And I stopped taking overseas visitors because I felt that unless one really understood the whole story of apartheid and the events leading up to it, etc., it was very unfair to just show people Vlakplaas.
You sketched an alternative scenario that could have been better for South Africa if things had been different.
I think de Klerk's proposal for an election in 1992 might have been implemented. He certainly wanted it. And if that had happened, the ANC would not have won because they hadn't prepared the ground sufficiently. You would have had to have what de Klerk was hoping we could achieve, a real power-sharing situation in which the ANC obviously would be part of the government, the Inkatha Freedom Party would be part of the government, and the National Party would be part of the government. And you would have a rotating presidency rather than one person having all the power. And I think if we'd got to that, it would have been that much more difficult for the ANC to continue with the second stage of the revolution, which was what it was critically aiming at.
So if Inkatha had got into government, do you think South Africa would see better employment figures and less violence and be a more normal country today?
I do. I know it's difficult to gauge, but I would think that certainly that counterfactual has credibility because they weren't aiming at a socialist outcome. They were able, I would think, to take advantage of the enormous goodwill towards South Africa. There was also an enormous feeling of relief and excitement at a new beginning after all this trauma of the People's War suddenly ended. And we had the peaceful election, and we had Mandela's inauguration, and we had the fly past of those jets across the sky. A sense that we really could now begin. And Mandela, instead of sort of stoking the war drums, now saying, this is the time to put the past behind us, this is the time for a brave new world. If Buthelezi and Mandela had both been saying that, linked together as a government of national unity with the National Party and the skills, resources that the whites could bring, I think this country could have flown. All its potential could have been so much better realised.
In the story we have now, it seems the ANC came to power through psychological operations of great political sophistication. Anthea Jeffrey attributes it to a political left-wing socialist people's war techniques using propaganda negotiations as a terrain of struggle, learnt from the former Soviet bloc. It's true that many of the leading figures were trained in the Soviet Union, and that relations with the South African Communist Party and its leader, Joe Slovo, were very close. But is Soviet influence the only possibility? Writers like Anthony Verrier have talked about how the British intelligence service recruited Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, both of which had a reputation as socialist moderates, and which hosted several ANC bases. According to the apartheid regime's spy chief Neil Barnard, MI6 recruited among the ANC too. Here he is, writing in his memoirs verbatim. English realised early on that the liberation movements were going to play an ever greater role in South Africa's political future. They were therefore careful not to openly flirt with the Boers while they lustily recruited sources in the liberation movements. Give the devil his due. Those in the espionage world who can read the unfolding of history early on can take care to have the right sources in the right time, at the right place. In our continent, they masterfully used the sometimes hasty process of independence to provide espionage training to the new services of Black Africa. It wasn't for philanthropic reasons, of course. With the recruitment of the best potential during this training, their agents and sources were placed very close to the heads of state of many countries, because that is where the people they trained ended up. It was worth 100 times more than all the big airports that were often set up by other former colonial powers in god-forsaken places in Africa, and where few planes land to this day. The British worked with dedication against South Africa's intelligence interests. For political expatriates, there were regular meals in top restaurants from London to Paris, from the best single malt Scotch whisky to Harris tweed jackets and Stilton cheese, scholarships for children, and discreet conversations with leading figures. So many South Africans compromised themselves, knowingly and unknowingly. The tragic thing is that some of them sit in the highest government circles in South Africa today, while they're vulnerable to the British in particular, who are probably now demanding their pound of flesh." End quote. That pound of flesh might have included protection of business and mining interests in South Africa, diamonds, gold and other precious metals. Some of the largest companies in the world in this field have British shareholders and are listed on the London Stock Exchange. Neither Mandela nor his successors nationalised these companies. That's something the British were surely grateful for. And there was this big corruption scandal where British Aerospace made a big arms deal with South Africa, which the country could barely afford just a few years after apartheid. In other respects, the ANC have proved much less business friendly, and poor policies and poor governance have left South Africa where it is today. The big question is obviously who in the ANC is compromised if Barnard is right. British historian Stephen Dorrell actually drops the name Nelson Mandela without expanding on it in his official history of the MI6. But Barnard's references to tweeds and whiskey actually suggests another former president of South Africa, a famous Anglophile, someone who came after Mandela.
People were looking for our uranium, gold, our iron ore, our manganese, and all these other strategic minerals. So the Brits and the Americans were making friends with the ANC and their cadres because they had a long-term strategy.
This is certainly a topic that merits further study. The British Embassy in Pretoria sponsored anti-regime publications, and when Mandela was released, got the SAS to train Mandela's bodyguards. There's a very interesting article in the prestigious South African Mail and Guardian newspaper where the ANC Deputy Foreign Minister is interviewed, admitting that MI6 came to the London offices of the ANC for tea and chats. Thabo Mbeki was there too. Later there were projects to get close to MK, the ANC's military wing, and Joe Modiz, the MK's thuggish leader, who was wined and dined by British security interests. It was he who later greenlighted the huge arms deal which benefited British industry. Did the British also advise the ANC on how to carry out psychological propaganda operations to defeat its rival at Boipatong and Bisho? In fairness, British Ambassador Robin Rennick writes in his memoirs that he urged Mandela to be friendly towards both de Klerk and Buthelezi. But pushing the liberation movement they supported, the ANC, at the expense of Inkatha, more sympathetic to Britain's adversary, the Afrikaner government, would be logical. And the British got what they wanted in the end, an ANC that was not anti-capitalist and did not nationalise. But the ANC did unfortunate things in other ways. The BAE kickback set the stage for a huge culture of corruption that made ANC politicians enrich themselves while failing to manage the country properly, to look after issues like infrastructure, employment strategy, and crime. I noticed the latter as soon as I caught an Uber from the airport to my hotel.
How crime has become, and crime these days doesn't have a name, doesn't have a skin color, doesn't have apartheid or democracy. It is just crime. Last year in April, I was shot both legs in an attempted hijacking.
You were shot in both legs?
Yes, I was shot in both legs.
Oh my God.
And surprisingly, I wasn't shot in town. I was shot right in the middle of a township where people of my same color reside. People of my same color reside, boys maybe even younger than me.
Why? Did they want to steal your car or something?
Yes. Broad daylight. I remember it was 3 p.m.
Did you go to hospital?
Yes, luckily I was doing courier services at the time. So I hired someone from home, from the neighborhood to come and assist. So now I had to cover this boy because he is my responsibility. So those guys started shooting from my side, right through the door. So both legs were shot. But luckily I still managed to drive the car to safety, and then we swapped seats. There is no visibility of police.
Yeah.
You can go throughout the whole area. You cannot even find one single car of police. Even when I got to the hospital after being shot, not even one police came. And surprisingly, the hospital that I was taken to is right next to the police station.
I guess many of these murders are never solved then.
No, never.
Oh, so.
Never. Because even mine, no one ever called to do an interview. The only thing, I just got an SMS saying that case number XYZ, there was an investigation done with no positive results, but the case has since been closed.
It is, yeah. The media say Ukraine is winning their war. They appear to get that wrong. Though of course BAE are making profits by selling their M777 howitzer systems to Ukraine. Western media like to give the impression there's not much wrong with the modern South Africa. Maybe they're wrong about that too. In the 1980s, before apartheid ended, South Africa was still a country with gleaming skyscrapers and shopping stores that rivaled Macy's in New York. The streets were busy at night, clean and prosperous. Gold and diamond mining operations generated huge wealth. And a military-industrial research complex produced atomic bombs and tanks. There was even a space program. South Africa had a surplus of electricity, the best roads in Africa, and one of the longest railway networks in the world. There was a functioning law and order system, a strict armed police force, and a Western system of law that punished, by hanging, ritual killings and rapes of infants.
Have you anything to say?
But really, we had a very, very good, flourishing country with a flourishing infrastructure that we gave over to the ANC. So just do your research and you will see how strong our Electric Supply Commission's reserves and capital and things was, and compare it to today.
In the absence of nationalisation in order to please the British, the ANC doubled down on another redistributionist measure, black empowerment in jobs and business ownership, also known as BEE. The effect of BEE, though, seems to have been to drive white skilled people out of jobs they were needed for society without creating a black skilled class. Small businesses have also suffered.
Is it true that white males can't get jobs?
Yes, that is true. And the sad thing is they have lots of skills. You know, they have 30, 40 years experience in certain of the critical areas where service delivery is not happening. For instance, sewage plants. There's engineers, there's whatever that worked at the council for 30 years that can solve the problem in their sleep, but they can't be employed.
The ANC was broad-based culturally. It wasn't any racist organization, but today they are more racist than the National Party ever was.
One of the companies that suffered most from the departure of white skills was the large electricity company Eskom.
I think there's an extreme lack of the necessary skills to manage such a large generation company.
Is it because a lot of white engineers had to leave or retire because there were too many for the racial quotas and they wanted to put in more black engineers?
Yes, that is simply exactly what happened. So although from time to time they get like contractors in, but on a permanent basis, yeah, that's exactly the situation.
The substation here at off Blackwood is on fire. Big problems here if the power is now off in your area. Blackwood, Three Rivers, near Fourways, the substation is on fire.
You know, the process has been accelerated through the BEE processes. Some would argue accelerated, to the detriment of an organisation. I'll give an example, like Eskom had very aggressive targets for changing the gender and racial profile of their entire staff, not just engineers. And these targets were, people's bonuses depended on achieving these targets in the PR departments, and so this transition happened quite quickly at Eskom. And maybe, and some would argue, that it's the root of some of their problems that they face today, in the skills issues. People, older white engineers were given opportunity for voluntary retrenchments and the payouts, to encourage them to make space for new upcoming people. And it's a subject of argument.
I realize that with BEE, it has limited us so much. I literally feel like somebody has put the handcuffs on me. I built a stunning business, but I could have done so much more because I have to limit this company to a turnover of 10 million. Otherwise, I'm no longer exempt to do business. If I grow the company, I have to give 51% away to black empowerment.
Which means you lose control, right?
Correct. I'll lose control of my own company, yes.
Things like BEE that I'm sure you're aware of, that's not always, in my opinion, working. The idea, I think, is necessary, but the way it's implemented only created a few super rich black people. It's not making any difference to the normal man on the street.
When you have a look at, say, another entrepreneur that's been in the same situation, so Mr. X or Miss X wants to carry on business with Joburg City Council, for example, they will, we call it window dress, their company, and they will put a person in place as a shareholder, and that person would actually now be sitting at home doing absolutely nothing. But we need your name, we need your ID, and now and then we need your signature. So they window dressed.
Are people shunning South Africa as an investment destination?
The problem has been the affirmative action laws. You know, the BEE legislation. So BEE legislation has turned into a very nasty thing, because basically what it means is that any investor into the country is unable to run their operation as they alone see fit, because they're obliged now to hive off large chunks of equity to be given to empowerment groups. And the problem now is those empowerment groups take that equity and then they flip it on the open market, turn it back into rands, which means that the company is no longer compliant. You see, so it's like a revolving door, revolving door, and they refuse to accept that there would be two categories of shareholding. So they refuse to accept that. They say there must be one category of shareholding. So the BEE legislation has, to a large extent, made the place uninvestable.
Like mining, farming was a big import earner in apartheid South Africa. Who can forget the Cape oranges and the Cape wine that every student took pleasure in boycotting? But it lacked the protective hand of the British, and farming was subject to its own particular form of black empowerment. Land redistribution, compulsory purchasing, to buy land away from white farmers and give it to black farmers. Like BEE, it's been a bit of a failure.
Even for the blacks, if they take your property from you, they will not register, let's take fixed property, they will not register it in the name of the black person. They will sign a lease agreement with a black person. So the problem is now, let's assume you get a farm from government. You cannot get money from the banks. How are you going to plow? How are you going to sow? How are you going to farm? It's not possible, and the banks won't lend you money on the value of the land. If we see the land that was given to blacks to farm, 80-90% of that farms didn't work. It's lying bare now. I can talk about Sepeko in Tsanin, for instance. That was a tea farm, and it employed, if I remember correctly, 2,500 people who were picking the tea leaves. It was handed over to the blacks, and there's one on the farm left, and he serves tea on that farm, and that's all that's on the farm.
Being with us here on Morning Live now, South Africa's unemployment rate has hit a record high, and that's from 34.4% according to the quarterly labour force survey in the second quarter of 2021 to 34.9%.
Well, let's head to South Africa now, where youth unemployment is at a staggering 66.5%.
If South Africa's uninvestable, that means no jobs for whites or blacks. Black economic empowerment has benefited a small number of blacks for taking a cut as window dressers for those companies who managed to get around the system. This is the new black elite which drives Porsches and lives in the formerly white-only suburbs. But most blacks are still powerless and unemployment is at record levels. The sacking of skilled whites might not have mattered if the new recruits coming on stream for professional jobs were as competent as the ones who left, but there are some doubts.
I do employ people from different races and different areas, and from experience, I know that is not true. if you didn't grow up in an environment where your mother or your father read you stories, your chance of being a reader is remote. And therefore, we're going to need another 2, 4, 3 generations, perhaps, before we can say, okay, the circumstances are equal.
How do you think the schooling is compensating for this lack of?
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately, and again, that is just part of, I think, any transition. The new government, of course, wanted to do their own thing. And I think we are now at the 4th or 5th different system that they're trying. And except for that, the problem is that we don't have educated people to educate people. So the kids are educated by people that are not really suitable for that, that is not qualified, that don't have the right mindset. So the vicious circle is still not solved.
There are schools here which is good schools, but these parents, these well-off parents, would rather send their kids to this school because here they don't have to pay school fees.
That's funny, isn't it? Because they're rich, but they don't want to spend that little bit extra on children's education. What does that tell you?
What does that tell me? That they don't care.
But how do the parents make their money then? I mean, that must be pretty clever, no? Or is it?
They have been in the situation where they haven't got jobs, and since the turn of everything in 1994, they got the jobs, they got the positions, which is quite frustrating because we're working with people in top level management positions who have no basic skills.
Twice a week, it runs the 1,000 miles from the Cape to Pretoria. At a sedate 40 miles an hour, you gaze out on the world through windows tinted with pure gold to keep down the glare. In the bar, a bridge class.
It's situated next to the police station.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've never heard of, seen or read anything where anybody was arrested for demolishing this whole system. And it's not the only station. We've got stations like Boksburg, East Station, Pollock Park in Springs, and there's like ports and all around the country. The railway system is down the drain. And the sad part of it is that those were functioning railway station. All the stations were functional, and everybody used the trains. And this is what they ended up with.
And this because it was one of the best railway systems in Africa.
And it was really a very, very, very good system. You could go on the blue train to Cape Town. The people went on holidays on trains, and it's a hectic situation now. Nobody is safe on a train, and nobody drive on any trains. And this is what it looks like. I mean, people used to park their cars here, get on the train, and go to work in Johannesburg and back in the afternoons. But I mean, look what's left of it. Was the trains.
Visiting the railway station at Benoni fills me with sadness, and I visited others too. Squatters live on the one-time platform of this commuter station to Johannesburg. The squatters are responsible for some of the destruction and the thefts, but there are thieves on the lines as well. The trains have to avoid the loose droppers that normally supply electricity from smashing the windscreen on the train cabs by zigzagging across lines. And it's also just a question of time before one of the railway bridges that still dot South Africa collapses.
These pillars that are in the ground are very high-grade ore. And those pillars were engineered by very clever, very smart engineers to hold up things like roads, railway lines, buildings, and other major infrastructure. Those pillars have now been removed. So we have a situation now where just take the N1 National Highway between Krugersdorp and Randfontein. That happens, because I know that area very well because I worked in that area extensively. There's a railway line and a national highway that is undermined by these summers, and the pillars have been taken away. So it's only a question of time before we have a train falling into an open void.
People's jobs are in danger when they can't get to work, so they go by taxi. The taxi minibus industry is thriving, but it's expensive for the poorly paid. Taxi wars break out occasionally when the taxi companies are not joining forces to shoot at the remaining commuter trains. The murder rate in South Africa is one of the highest in the world at around 35 per 100,000. While apartheid was all about law and order, today lawlessness has taken over. One of Benoni's sub-police stations has been ransacked. They've even stolen the manhole covers. My guide, a former policeman at this station, is heartbroken.
It's really heartbreaking to see the country went down the drain in 30 years.
Yeah.
You've seen the railway station.
Yeah.
And right through the country, the railway stations look like that. You can't go into the center of town and do business anymore.
Right.
Because the chances of getting hijacked or robbed is very, very high.
Yeah.
So all the main businesses moved out of the center of the cities. That's why the center of the cities look like it is.
Isn't the unemployment rate quite high in South Africa?
Very high. It's the highest ever.
I want to rectify this situation where the European and American media stopped writing about South Africa, but in the 1980s they were very busy condemning South Africa.
They should say, you were the people that was pushing for this. It happened. The country was given to them functional. This is what happened after 30 years. Where are you now? Where are you now?
Shortly after, I saw a white man in the street next to an electricity cabinet with two black men. There's no power at all in the entire street.
What are you doing here? Trying to get our electricity back at the moment. Because with the load shedding, what happened is on Friday they came and they actually stole all the cables we had. So yeah, now we can't go do any work because our entire street here is standing. It's all standing.
So you're kind of losing money basically because of these power cuts.
Tons of it.
And have you lived in Benoni all your life?
I don't actually live in Benoni, but I've been working now for the past 7 years.
Is it kind of getting worse, like the streets and the...
Every single day.
One of the consequences of the ANC's war on Inkatha 30 years ago is that the party that promotes BEE cannot get voted out. There are no alternatives, and so South Africa declines. BEE begets poverty and unemployment, which begets violence, which deters foreign investment, all in a vicious circle. South Africa's schizophrenic.
There's chaos that would never happen in Europe. Then you go from visiting a shopping centre to an evening Uber ride when the power is on and South Africa seems first world. Then you remember the conversations you've had with South Africans about the violence they've seen, and that's not first world. The Uber driver, black, who's shot in both legs in a township, and all he got from the police was an SMS to say the case was closed. The white charity director who witnessed a gun battle in his local cafe the day before we met. The hotel owner who swerved past a roadblock in South Johannesburg by driving on the pavement, but the couple behind were killed. The computer shop where I bought an adapter plug, where 3 people had been gunned down just months before. It's one of the reasons that the South African infrastructure is declining. The taxi wars I've mentioned, but then there's the construction mafia.
So in around 2014, 2015, we saw the emergence, specifically in KwaZulu-Natal, of groups of people calling themselves local business forums that came together, and they basically said, look, if a project is taking place, we want to cut off that project. Guys going on sites, putting their AKs on the table and saying to the guys, give us a stake in the project. Your life is worth less in the bullet for this gun.
With all these things going on, it's not surprising that some white South Africans I speak to worry that their country's changing for the worse, that it's becoming Africanized. They say that the problem is not political. It's not the ANC per se, as I've argued throughout this film. It's the fact that we're in Africa, and the problems of corruption, chaos and violence is because the black majority are now defining the character of the nation. Even if the bad things about violence and corruption were somehow resolved, there would still be differences in culture that are hard to resolve. Simple lifestyle things. I remember driving around Soweto with a black tour guide. He said everything happened on the street in Africa and pointed to the hairdressers doing their job on the street. When this driver took white girls on tours to Soweto, they loved this openness and couldn't be torn away from having their dreadlocks done. White males were much more sceptical. He and I later drove around the rich suburbs with endless hedgerows and walls concealing Tudor-style houses. He shuddered. This was not for the Africans, he said, even when they could afford it. Too cold, inhumanely antisocial. Facing all this, what should the whites do? It seems to crystallize around a few options. The first is to emigrate. Many of the young do, or those who have sought-after skills like engineering, or have British passports. The English speakers who have at least one British grandparent can get British citizenship easily. The young generation's loss is keenly felt among the parents' generation.
There's always sadness when I talk to parents talking about their children. The kids can't get a job because of BEE. Their education wasted unless they emigrate.
For 6 or 7 years, go to university to just almost before you apply know that you wouldn't be getting the work. Parents have got kids that all go abroad, so you've done your best, you've raised the kids, they've gone to university, just to lose them to our overseas markets because there's just much more opportunity, and I think in our country that's probably one of our biggest problems.
But immigration is only one option. Some are too old, too committed to their country, or can't get foreign passports, or a combination of the three. So they decide to stay. The decision is more common among Afrikaners than English speakers, like historian Henny.
I want to tell you, I am an Afrikaner. I am a Boer. My language is Afrikaner from the continent of Africa. I'm not an Englishman. I can't go to Britain. I'm not a Dutchman. I can't go to Holland. I'm a Boer. I'm a South African.
But if they stay, how do they make it work? Some look over the shoulders of the ANC-run structures by suggesting volunteer parallel services that actually work, like new ideas for sewage management, volunteer fire brigades, or by forming charities to fix potholes and make towns clean again and attract investment. Often there's a kind of mentor relationship with blacks. The second option for those who want to stay is not so much to help build a new South Africa against the odds, but to withdraw and to seek to form own communities. Not as a way to oppress the blacks, but simply to be among their own. More of that shortly. The brothers Rensburg are certainly not withdrawing from today's South Africa, but are trying to participate by reforming the sewage system to cope with large squatter communities and the collapse of the old sewage systems due to inadequate maintenance.
Very often you will find that sewage is dumped into the Vaal River, for instance, which pollute our biggest dam, one of the biggest dams, the Vaal River. And they build these shacks in or close to the rivers, and they wash in the rivers. Everything goes into the rivers, and then it ends up in the dams. The population is growing and growing and growing, and we're getting more and more illegal people coming into South Africa, but the government is not looking after the water and the quality of the water.
In this wastewater catchment area, the pump is long since broken, and the untreated sewage flows straight into the Vaal River. We walk around, I see a scavenging dog scampering across a puddle in front of our car. It's like a scene from Tarkovsky's Stalker, where the heroes visit a nuclear-irradiated post-apocalyptic zone in the Soviet Union. It's a bit like that.
Over the last almost 30 years, the focus was really on trying to rehabilitate existing wastewater treatment infrastructure and the associated networks with pump stations and underground sewer networks, etc. We've introduced, we've taken the concept of constructed wetlands to the Department of Water and Sanitation. But we've actually taken the concept of engineered constructed wetlands to the next level. And we've patented a design called the vertical upflow modular constructed wetland. And we have a pet term for it, which it's called a wetland in a box. Because you know what? At 50,000 litres of raw effluent that enters our water catchment systems per second, that is a problem of gargantuan proportions. These wetland in a box technologies, even constructed wetland for that matter, is not only a viable alternative, it can be plonked down wherever there's new informal settlements or formal settlements developing across the country, rather than the old, very heavy, very resource and financially intensive wastewater treatment works. Chemical stuff.
Our next interview was with Baron Lachansi, who runs a charity, the Privilege Foundation, that conciliates blacks and whites in small town communities by getting them together to form clean-up teams. Small towns, often poor physical state being one of the reasons for aggravation between the races.
We started it in about 5.5 years ago with one town, they call it Colonial, in the northern province, a very small town. But there was a specific incident where a boy died, and many of the people in the township, Tabalugang, thought it was as a result of two white men that caused that young boy's death. And there was a clash between black and white. And that is something in South Africa, with our history of apartheid, we can't afford that. There's not a good relationship between the different race groups, black and white. And what can we do so that people in a year's time or 5 years' time still work together, and so that such an incident doesn't happen again? And they started with a project that we call it the CRPP project. And that's a very simple project. The C stands for cleaning, the R for repairing, the first P for painting, and the last one for planting. Clean, repair, paint, and plant. To look at the aesthetic part of a town. And that is not only the one town, we also started it with in the township itself, so that everybody can benefit. And the reason for that is that we want to make a town tourist friendly. We want to make it investment friendly, so that people can come there and to say, listen, this is a place where we want to spend our money.
If you can't emigrate and you can't get the society to work, that leaves a third option. Apartheid redux, creating new white societies within South Africa. You can see the point. There is fear at the back of minds that the city is yielding to the jungle and that South Africa is becoming just like the rest of Africa. You don't see it in the shopping malls of Pretoria or Johannesburg, and the roads are pretty good, but you feel it creeping around the edges in the growth of shantytowns spreading across the previously empty veldt as the population grows by 1 million a year. You see it in the power cuts and the sewage issues and the broken railways. It's not even the Africa of primitive virtue and wealth idealized by the philosopher Rousseau. Rather, it's the American travel writer Paul Theroux's futureless dystopian, world-gone-wrong Mad Max Africa of child soldiers, street gangs, reeking slums, refuse heaps and utter despair. Theroux's Africa is one where technology tantalizes the Africans with visions of the unattainable, driving many of them to be refugees and bludgers in Europe and America. He says that we've bestowed on Africa just enough of the disposable junk of the modern world to create in African cities a junkyard replica of the West, a mirror image of our own failures, but no better than that. He was referring to the megacities of Central Africa, places like Congo's Kinshasa or Luanda or perhaps Lagos, but it's becoming more and more like a good description of South Africa too. Not all of South Africa is endless township development. There are beautiful residential areas, and the guest houses, surprisingly cheap, offer a luxury respite to daily visits to declining places. These guest houses allow me to gather my thoughts. Just mentioning the word apartheid gets many people's intellectual defences up. But let's understand intelligent Afrikaners' historians' take on it, which was that the Afrikaners were far from being saints, but the racial society they built up was not so different from many of the Anglo countries. The US had Jim Crow laws until the late 60s, and South Africans inherited the British land appropriation laws imposed on its South African colonies. That originally the homelands just meant a kind of decolonization of the sort carried out by the great powers in Africa in the 1960s and 70s. In Algeria, the French separated from Algerians. In Congo, the Belgians left the Congolese and went home. In Kenya, the Brits sold their houses and had their lawns ploughed up. They went home. Africa for the Africans. The Europeans went back to Europe. So in South Africa, you had separation too. The Africans went to their tribal lands, and the Europeans, who'd been in Africa centuries, had lands of their own inside the greater South African state. On paper, it could even be made to sound reasonable, and a Minister of Black Affairs, or Bantu Affairs as it was called, could sound idealistic and paternalistic about being on hand to help the blacks if they needed it. Here is a minister talking in the 1950s.
Which is strange to some people in the Western world, namely, that the peoples of Africa, and so the Bantu people of South Africa, have a beautiful civilization of their own, which is worth preserving. There are many facets of this civilization, for instance, the social warmth of the Bantu peoples, which we Westerners can rightly envy them. Now, we also have a peculiar Western adaptation to Africa. Therefore, we can say that the Bantu peoples are a flower and the Western peoples are a flower, each with a beauty of its own.
One problem was the implementation.
In February 1978, the Minister of Plural Relations gave expression to the implications of the Verwoerd dream for South Africa. If our policy is taken to its logical conclusion, as far as the black man is concerned, there will be not one black man with South African citizenship. Their policy, apartheid and the Bantustan plan. Its logical conclusion, dispossession, impoverishment and dehumanization. 18 million blacks, 71% of South Africa's total population, had been allocated 14% of the land, fragmented into 10 Bantustans. Every black person would be compelled to accept citizenship of a Bantustan, and being deprived of all citizenship rights in the rest of South Africa, be tolerated as a guest worker, living in the Bantustan and entering South Africa as a migrant laborer.
The economy of South Africa was far too integrated for homelands to be viable, and the whites had all the good land. But the principle should be correctly understood. The Afrikaners were Africans and had the right to at least some of the land, even though the distribution ended up skewed, and the economy needed integration. But arguably the Afrikaners atoned for their earlier greed by in fact giving up the rule of their whole society that they built up. And it's this that now some younger ones want to reverse. Apartheid 2.0.
Apartheid, which in English has the sound of apart and hate, whereas in Afrikaans it simply signifies separate development. What the Afrikaners tried to do was to say, okay, this discrimination purely based on race cannot persist. It's immoral. We have to have a different constitutional dispensation because all the peoples of the world aspire to the same thing, to self-determination, to participation in the political process. And the way they wanted to achieve it with this separate development was to unscramble the colonial egg again, to say, okay, let's reconstitute almost the pre-colonial, pre-British setup, where you had the Zulu kingdom, the Xhosas, the Tswanas, etc.
The homelands of Bantustans like Ciskei and Transkei were mainstays of the anti-apartheid criticism and were ridiculed in the Western media as being puppet states with no real resources. They were not given the best land. That may be so, but the new Apartheid 2.0 accepts that argument by toying with the idea, as it were, of a divorce that would leave the wife and the kids with everything, just walking away and starting again. AfriForum does not talk in racially charged terms like Apartheid 2.0, but some of its staff are interested in recreating separate communities for their own people, and who knows where this will lead. AfriForum is one of the most popular organisations among the Afrikaners. More than 1 in 10 of the 3 million Afrikaners pay monthly subscription fees, and it has elegant offices staffed by young smart people, mother tongue Afrikaans, south of Pretoria. It's a strange hybrid of think tank and policy forum. It partly lobbies the ANC into smarter policies. It's also a cultural organisation, and it has a semi-military neighbourhood patrol network. Their philosophy is to help the blacks for sure, but also to create hub communities for the increasingly defensive Afrikanerdom, to be taught in their own language.
This is the Limpopo River, that's between South Africa and Zimbabwe. There are many parts of this river where we found handmade bridges for when the river's in full flow. Obviously, there's a lot of crocodiles in the river, so the guys who are coming, illegal immigrants, would just build a handmade bridge, and they would crisscross on terms whenever they want, anytime. Nothing is stopping them. So when the river's also in full flow and they want to get vehicles from South Africa to Zimbabwe, they just use donkeys to pull the vehicle over the river. So they are quite creative in their ways.
And then there's a no man's land where you can buy literally anything.
Yeah. So there are actually a few of these halfway points or checkpoints, if I can use that word, where it's in the middle of the Limpopo River, where you can literally stop there. You can buy cool drink, you can buy clothes, a fridge if you want. At one stage we asked those guys, what's the cost and time frame for me for buying a full automatic AK-47, and the price was 2,000 rand, and it would be available within 24 hours. So
that's incredible. And how much is that in dollars, US dollars?
In dollars, that would be around $140, $130.
Llewellyn is head of patrols. Having told me about the porous border with Zimbabwe, where smuggling is rife, he sets out the plan for the day: to clean up a drug dealer's park and to instruct a local patrol community in one of the emerging Afrikaner hubs. And the ANC is kind of critical. They can't believe that you'd be
non-racial group, they have to put in the race angle somehow. But
yes. Yes, so that's always their go-to card. When we saw the Natal riots last year, one of the answers from Fikile and Bulula regarding the unrest was, this is just because of apartheid again. Apartheid's been gone for a couple of years now, man. You just can't hammer on that same excuse the whole time. If that's your own party that's rioting against you because of service delivery, what's apartheid got to do with that?
Yeah.
Sorry, just hold on a second.
So these guys are squatters?
Yeah, squatters, yeah.
Okay, white squatters? That's...
Yeah. Something you don't see every day.
No.
Yeah, I know those guys. You see the difference between before it's cleaned and afterwards.
Right,
And what we're trying to achieve.
And are those guys with you as well? Those ones in the...
Yeah. So these guys get actually paid. The money we get to pay them comes from volunteers, comes from donations, and comes from companies. A guy staying over here gives his 50 rand a day, he's 50 rand a month to help us to establish a team like this to clean.
Right.
It's part of the do-it-yourself movement.
Right.
Do you need them in the background?
Not necessarily, no. So tell us what we're doing after this.
So we're on our way about 3 kilometers to the west. There's an area where there's illegal settlers coming into our neighborhoods, and they having illegal connections to electricity. They're selling drugs. We had a situation this past Saturday where a school child in his school uniform were ODing on drugs, which was bought from that area. And the illegal immigrants which sold him the drugs, he was about 14 years old. They were just standing there, they couldn't care less. So we had to get EMS out and support him. So we're going to that area alongside with the Tshwane Metro Police Department. Hopefully they will show, they promise to join us. If they show, we will have some search and seizures, possibly of illegal drugs and other contraband. And then if they are not showing, we will only have a visibility patrol whereby we make our presence known and we show these people that these neighborhoods belong to us and we don't want these illegal activity coming into our neighborhoods. So we want to protect our school children from this. Everybody is welcome to live in the Moed, but no one with illegal activities is welcome.
Right, so tell us about these this Afrikaner hubs that you're talking about.
Well, what happened, we identified 30 places where through Solidariteit, which is part of the entities we work closely with, where the Afrikaner is currently flocking to be among themselves, because they are so thinly spread. It's not that the Afrikaner are so few in number, they're just thinly spread. And it's naturally just happening that they start flocking together and start living together and start operating together. And that was a very interesting piece of research that was done by Solidariteit.
The Afrikaners I spoke to, and nearly all the whites I spoke to in this film, have Afrikaner origins, want us to get away from the picture of their people always being associated with apartheid and oppression, which they think almost libelous and certainly lacks context. The Afrikaner-dominated security forces' crimes were highlighted in the trials and commissions that took place after the turn.
Let's not forget that the ANC's misdeeds were arguably even more brutal.
Necklacing, killing by hanging a petrol-filled tyre around a person's neck and then igniting the petrol. This gruesome method was used by
ANC activists against suspected informers and traitors in the townships, as well as their Inkatha opponents. Few, if any, were punished for this.
That regime can go to hell. Power to the people! Power to the people! We have stones, we have boxes of matches, we have with our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
But we are asking, what about the then Executive Committee of the ANC? They collectively asked for amnesty before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was denied. And nobody of the then Executive Committee of the ANC was prosecuted up till today. Why don't they prosecute them? Why do they only focus on the old security police and nothing happens to the other side of the ANC, who was also involved in atrocities in the past?
The fact that the ANC punished their own people with death, that was completely new to me. I mean, is that the kind of atrocity they would be punished for?
Absolutely. They were these called necklace murders, where they put a tire around your neck and fill it with petrol and set it alight. And there's footage of it. You can see the perpetrators, and nothing happened. And that is in South Africa, not even talking about what happened outside of South Africa. We've heard about atrocities in these Quattro camps that they had in Angola and Mozambique. I mean, they were in Botswana and Lesotho. What happened there, we don't know. But people are too afraid to come to the fore to say, but this happened to me in Angola or wherever, and it needs to be investigated and the perpetrators be prosecuted, but they're afraid to do it.
There were many rapes and killings at their guerrilla camps. The Afrikaners don't only want to settle scores with the ANC, but also with their historic adversary, the British, to whose empire they were incorporated in 1902, after the Boer republics, Transvaal and Free State, lost their independence after the Boer War. They see double standards here too, and dislike the fact that what is exploited is the Western public's knowledge of recent histories, mostly through half-remembered headlines, which were only half true even at the time. Sure, the Afrikaners did cruel things during apartheid, but come on, let's put it all on the table. There's a very interesting book by Harvard historian Caroline Elkins, which is very critical of British imperialism. For Elkins, the practice of blowing Indian sepoys from cannons after the 1857 uprising in India, the Maxim gun slaughter of Mahdists in the 1890s, and the use of concentration camps in the Boer Wars, the massacre of peaceful protesters in Amritsar, all this was just the British Empire warming up. They could get away with things, but the South Africans couldn't.
You see, it's a very, very interesting question. Now, let's look at these events that you have described. Look at the actions of the British in India. And you must remember, we were a British colony. We were part of the British Empire. And in 1922, we had the Bilhoek affair. Translating Bilhoek means the corner where the bull is, an ox. The Bilhoek affair. And there the police, very colonial, killed a large number of dissidents. But that was how the empire acted. If you were against the empire, it happened in the Roman Empire, it happened in the British Empire.
The worst came when Britain was protecting its colonial gains after the Second World War, a time when world community was focused on the Afrikaner South Africans. For instance, the Operation Progress to subdue rebellion in Kenya was so bad that the colony's Attorney General at the time called it distressingly reminiscent of conditions in Nazi Germany or Communist Russia. Elkin is no fool, and she's been backed up by other reputable sources like the Professor of African Politics at Oxford University called David Anderson, who reckons the death toll in the Mau Rebellion would have been as high as 25,000, whereas only 32 whites died in that same period. He was quoted saying that everything that could happen did happen. Allegations about beatings and violence were widespread. Basically, you could get away with murder. It was systematic.
There's a famous book, Pulitzer Prize winning book, about the decolonization of Kenya. A research by, I think it was a professor, who started out thinking that, okay, this is an excellent example of how it should have been done, till she really encountered what actually occurred, where women's nipples were torn off with pliers in the camps. The menfolk were rolled up in barbed wire and then kicked around like soccer balls, and it's an amazing aspect of English media culture that this has not received attention, that it's simply ignored.
After the Boers lost the war against the British in 1902, the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910, chiefly with British characteristics.
The first laws, the very first laws that the British then put back on the statute books in the Free State and Transvaal, where it had not existed before, were the typical British laws on interracial, prohibiting interracial sexual intercourse and marriage. The other laws that were then under British rule imposed and that were really very detrimental to people of colour was the 1913 land laws, where the lands of the indigenous Africans were effectively confiscated to the Crown.
At AfriForum, we go through trouble to once again remind the Afrikaner and tell them it is okay to be Afrikaner, it's okay to be part of your culture and your tradition, and you're allowed to be proud of your history. Every country in this world made mistakes in the past.
The white male is the worst guy in the world. He's always a Nazi. I mean, it's always this language that's used, and I can imagine that you've had much more of it than we have had in Europe.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. And that's once again why people will simply say, well, I'm not a Boer, I'm not an Afrikaner, I don't have anything to do with them. Because of that, just being demonized all the time. And like I said earlier, if you can go to any country in this world, every tribe in this world, all of them made lots of mistakes in the past. And we can choose to focus on the mistakes made, or we can focus on the good things that happen.
On my last afternoon heading back to the airport, there's a power cut or load shedding for 2 hours. The airport is thankfully exempt from power cuts, but much of the rest of Johannesburg is dark. The reason is that the 2 coal power stations that were set to supply South Africa with energy in the 2020s are a decade late. The reason? Lack of engineering expertise. During load shedding, ATMs are down, so are petrol stations, and so are traffic lights. Despite this inconvenience, it can be eerily beautiful, and it prompts me to reflect on my trip. The Afrikaners think of themselves not as oppressors, but more like the oppressed. It's not the whole truth, but there is a truth to it. Oppressed by the British Empire historically, and now the ANC, which the Brits helped into power in Afrikaner political law. But the Afrikaners are not alone in this sense of victimhood. If you see the globalist empire, or Anglo-hegemony, as just a mutation of the British Empire for the 21st century. In that thinking, the Trump presidency with its nationalist features was an American patriots' revolt against the London, New York, Washington axis in the spirit of the revolution of 1776. Many Afrikaners like the straight-talking Trump with his unpretentious tastes. Today, the globalist empire has full control of the Western world's narrative outlets through London and New York's newspapers and television channels. It controls the world's reserve currency, the dollar, and is able to move large groups of people about, like Arabs to Sweden, much as the original empire moved Malays to the Cape or blacks to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. It's also become the empire of woke, but you could argue that that's just a power plot of turning all the European peoples, as it were, into peoples as racist as the Afrikaners were once seen. in order to manipulate and control. You could argue that the way that BBC and the mainstream media in the West demonize anyone who votes for the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, the AFD in Germany, or Brexit in the UK, as far right, is using the same psychological mind tricks as used a generation earlier in the demonization of the Afrikaners. There's no understanding or attempts to put into context people's fears and the consequences.
Addis Ababa Airport, Ethiopia, a major transit hub from Europe to Africa and vice versa.
I make a stopover here on my flight from Johannesburg.
It feels as if it's the harbinger of a new multipolar world. When I was a child, Europe had twice Africa's population. In 20 years, Africa is expected to have 5 times Europe's population, 2.5 billion people. Europe's demography will doubtless change.
What have I learned? I used to divide Western, UK and US foreign policy into 2 parts. The good interventions against Nazism and apartheid, and the dubious interventions of the 21st century against Libya, Iraq, and covertly against Syria. These have all made me thoroughly anti-interventionist. Libya is still suffering from serious civil war 12 years after being rescued, quote-unquote, by NATO in a campaign where the British and the British press were in the forefront of urging aggression. There is a need for a revisionist and more subtle view of the apartheid era, the struggle against apartheid, and the time after, so to understand why the Rainbow Nation concept has failed. Africans are suffering huge economic failure 30 years after the end of apartheid, under a government of their own choosing, while many whites with skills want out one way or another. We're living in a time of great crisis, great population growth, and great social and economic inequalities. Who gets to live where on this crowded planet, and how are we going to live together successfully, is one of the great questions of this century. That's why the example of South Africa is important to study.